Hello and welcome to Lecture 17 of Ancient and Medieval Worlds. This time we're going to be going over a very brief history of ancient Judaism. That is, the origins of the Jewish religion in and throughout the ancient world. And there are a couple of problems with this lecture, both part one here and what we'll be talking about in part two. And the first is that I'm going to be talking about things that are the provenance of contemporary religious belief for many of my students. Now, my job as a historian is to present a secular view of history, which may contradict those beliefs. I'm not here to attack what you believe, but to present you with a summary of what I can determine as the best scholarly consensus, although there is not always scholarly consensus. But whatever you believe, it cannot hurt to know a secular approach as well. Second, this is the only lecture in the 38 or so that we have that's going to be dedicated solely to Jewish history, though we are going to discuss Jews again multiple times in other contexts during the medieval period. And unfortunately, we are going to end shortly after when Christianity begins. That's a pretty common thing in history textbooks to do because most of them are written with a Christian bias, consciously or unconsciously. And Christian historians have long seen Jewish history as nothing but a precursor to Christianity, and then subsequently ignore medieval Jewish history until the 20th century and the creation of the modern nation of Israel. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Well, given the limited time that we have in this class, the best solution that I have been able to find to this is to continue the story a little further, to show how Judaism continued to develop in the aftermath of the birth of Christianity. We can't go as far as I would like. This lecture is already jam-packed as it is. But Judaism, I really need to stress this point, is far more than simply a precursor to the later monotheistic faiths of Christianity and Islam. However, it is also necessary to understand Judaism in order to understand the history of both of those later religions. So this lecture fulfills many goals. Jews are an important subject of the Jewish history is an important subject of study in its own right. That's part of why we'll be discussing this. One thing that you'll also notice from looking at parts 1 and 2 is that it sort of gives us a lens on everything we've already covered in the ancient world and some of the stuff that we will be covering in the next few lectures from a different perspective, from the perspective of someone who was not a major empire, a major player in the politics of the period, but rather a remote, in some cases, figure, although in other cases much more involved in the day-to-day affairs of the world that we've been looking at. So those are two excellent reasons. And a third is that you do need to understand something about the history of Judaism in order to be able to actually appreciate the history of Christianity and the history of Islam that we'll be looking at in future lectures. Well, let's get some of the terminology out of the way first, and then get into the fuzzy earliest history. What do we call these people? Well, and there are disagreements on this front. What to call someone is one of the most important things one can decide about them, and not everyone agrees at all points. But the general consensus is that they're not really properly Jews or Jewish or believers in Judaism until somewhere in the 500s BCE, for reasons that we'll get into. That is not coincidentally right around the time that we start having much more firm textual historical sources, or at least our textual sources start to appear in the form that we have them today. Before that, we should technically refer to them as perhaps Israelites, descendants of the legendary third patriarch called Israel, or more commonly Jacob. Now, that's not the same thing as the modern term Israeli. The terms are not synonymous. An Israeli is a citizen of the modern nation of Israel. The terms are obviously related to each other, but they're used distinctly in scholarship. Israelite refers to the ancient peoples really before, earlier than 500s BCE, or even earlier than that. We also sometimes call them Hebrews because that's the language that they originally spoke before about 500 BCE and to varying degrees thereafter, although eventually it became more of a second language primarily used in religion until it was revived as a spoken language in the 20th century by the modern nation of Israel. The word Jew we'll see appear later on in this course. and that is technically a derivation from the name Judah, one of the 12 tribes of the Israelites that eventually became, as we'll see, one of the two kingdoms. The kingdom of Judah, which eventually came to be pronounced as Judea by the Romans. And that's where we get our modern word Jew or Jewish. And we'll see why this makes sense a bit later on as we get into the course, as we get into the history that we'll be talking about. To understand the early history of the Hebrew or Israelite people, we have to rely to some degree on the Hebrew Bible, not, however, necessarily taking it at face value. The Hebrew Bible is a complicated source made up of multiple sections that we call books, although they were originally scrolls. Many of those are about time periods significantly earlier than when they were written down in the form that we can read them now. What do I mean by Hebrew Bible? Well, it's commonly referred to by Christians as the Old Testament, but that's rather insensitive because calling it the Old Testament implies that there is a New Testament, the later Christian Bible, which of course Jews do not believe in. The technical term in Hebrew is Tanakh, which is actually the first letters of its three components, but it's more often simply called the Torah for its first component, where the T and the Tanakh comes from. That is, strictly speaking, only the first 5 books or scrolls of the Hebrew Bible, containing the story of the creation of the world, the first Israelites, and the story of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt. This is also often called the Law, but the Torah contains more than just laws, although the two terms are often used synonymously with each other. Ever since historians and archaeologists first attempted to understand the era described by the Hebrew Bible in a modern secular context, really starting with scholarship in the 1700s CE or so, scholars have debated how much of the story of Genesis and Exodus is true. And the answer is we can't really know. But we can put this legendary account in the Torah into a context that is, in its broadest outlines, possible, if completely unverifiable. It is possible that someone like the legendary forefather of the Jewish peoples, Abraham, might have migrated from Mesopotamia to the Levant, as is described in Genesis, sometime in the early to mid 2nd millennium BCE, during the height of the Late Bronze Age. Genesis describes God giving Abraham the land of Canaan in the southern Levant as a promised Holy Land. And this is a critical legend for monotheists, including later Christians and Muslims, and I'm going to return to the story of Abraham multiple times in this course. It's also entirely possible that Abraham's descendants could have migrated into Egypt, perhaps with the Hyksos in the Second Intermediary Period, were then enslaved, and then migrated back into the Levant during the Late Bronze Age collapse, as the rest of the Torah part of the Hebrew Bible relates. And is absolutely essential to later Jewish identity. This Moses story is one of the most critical ones, most often repeated in later Jewish sources. That said, we have no references outside of the Hebrew Bible for corroboration, and the parts of the Hebrew Bible we do have, although they may be based on earlier oral accounts, were only written down much later and edited even later than that. Certainly, we have no outside references for the pivotal legend of Moses leading this deliverance as the first of the prophets, those who speak for God. Things get a little less murky at this point in the aftermath of description of Genesis, Exodus, and the rest of the books of the Torah, because we get our first reference to Israelites as a defeated people in an Egyptian war memorial just after 1200 BCE. As the Late Bronze Age collapse was ongoing. But whether they were anything like the Israelites described in the Hebrew Bible, which was only written down in the form we have it centuries later, is another question entirely. I'm getting a little ahead of myself there. What we have is a reference to a destruction. It's a list of destructions by the Egyptians, and one of those tribes said to be destroyed is a tribe called Israel, and its seed was not. We don't really get a long description of who they were. They're just one of the people that this Egyptian pharaoh is claiming that he beat up on. Well, in the aftermath of the Exodus out of Egypt, the Hebrew Bible claims that there were 2 legendary Israelite kings, David and his son Solomon, who ruled over a mighty kingdom in the southern Levant called Israel in the 900s BCE, from about 1000 until a little before 900 BCE. According to biblical tradition, it was these two kings who established the capital at Jerusalem, where Solomon founded the temple that became the center of Israelite religious life, staffed by a hereditary priesthood. We do have outside evidence from the next century after David and Solomon, that is in the 800s BCE, for a kingdom called Israel. And of course, as we have seen before, the Levant enjoyed something of a renaissance at exactly this time during the Late Bronze Age collapse, as it was finally free of foreign interference before the rise of the Iron Age empires like the Neo-Assyrians and Neo-Babylonians. We'll see them again in a moment. But the Hebrew Bible's description of the glorious scale of the reigns of David and Solomon, and of the magnificence of their capital city of Jerusalem with its massive central temple, is not backed up by the archaeological evidence. Not all scholars even believe that David and Solomon existed, and certainly, even if they did, folk tales seem to have accrued around both of them later on. By the time we start seeing regular outside references to Israelites and have a sustained and widespread archaeological record, there are already two kingdoms of Hebrew-speaking peoples, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, based around Jerusalem. According to the Hebrew Bible, these had once been the one kingdom under David and Solomon in the 900s, but then split, and the northern 10 tribes continued to call themselves Israel, while the southern tribe of Judah was still ruled by David's descendants. But the Hebrew Bible is largely written from the perspective of the kingdom of Judah, which didn't always get along well with Israel. We can confirm from outside sources that in 722 BCE, the northern Hebrew kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the revived Neo-Assyrian Empire. And as I was careful to point out when I described this Iron Age empire many lectures ago, the Assyrians were famous for forcibly exiling conquered peoples from their homelands to purposefully destroy their identity and thus their resistance to Assyrian rule. And this is exactly what happened to the kingdom of Israel. Later legends continued about the 10 tribes, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They continued for many centuries. Really, they continue down to this day. Many still imagine they can find the 10 lost tribes of Israel, but evidence overwhelmingly suggests that those that did not flee to Judah were wiped out, not literally, but culturally, along with many other Iron Age peoples in this time period under the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The same almost happened to the surviving Hebrew kingdom of Judah, when the successors of Assyria, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, destroyed the city of Jerusalem and forcibly exiled its kings, nobles, priests, scribes, and craftsmen, that is, the cultural elites of Judah, and forced them to come live in the capital of the empire at Babylon in 587 BCE. The Babylonian Captivity from 587 to 539 BCE should have ended the people of Judah just as it had ended the 10 lost tribes of Israel, but it did not. And that is because these exiled Judeans, or as they increasingly come to be called Jews from Judea, or Judah, devised an ingenious way to help preserve their identity without their homeland or their temple, a feat I know of no other ancient people accomplishing. They did it by creating the Hebrew Bible. I know this is a bit shocking for those of you who may consider the Hebrew Bible to be sacred scripture, that is, the Word of God, but this is not an incompatible way of describing it. Let me explain what I mean, because it's important to understand the history of the many pieces of the Hebrew Bible and how it can be used as a primary historical source for the period it was written in, and sometimes as a secondary historical source for the periods that it describes. The Hebrew Judeans exiled to Babylon, or as we might call them now Jews, a term derived from the name of their kingdom, of Judah, brought with them some religiously and historically significant writings that formed the core of what became the Hebrew Bible. But the version that survives down to us today was added to and importantly edited into roughly the form that we have it starting in Babylon during the captivities in the 500s BCE. Now, modern scholars have spent generations trying to analyze the parts of the Hebrew Bible and have discovered using internal evidence how this editing took place. This is a very important field of study that's called the documentary hypothesis, the idea that many documents went into making even individual books or scrolls of the Torah and the rest of the Hebrew Bible. For instance, to give an example of how this works, if you read just a few chapters into the first book of the Bible, Genesis, you find two different stories of Noah's flood with different numbers of animals on his famous ark. Now, theologians have a variety of different religious explanations for that, but secular literary scholars have argued that this is the editing of two different stories together into a single text. These stories were combined together by the exiled Jews in Babylon, and they may have borrowed a fair amount from the Babylonians, possibly even borrowing the story of the flood itself, as we saw the existing Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh already had a flood story thousands of years before this. Another example could be the prophet Isaiah. That's another book, a very important prophetic book in the Tanakh. Parts of it seem to have been composed in Judah before the Babylonian captivity. Parts of it seem to have been composed during the captivity, and another part of it, a final portion, seems to have been composed after the captivity. But all of it has been put together into one book. Exactly which books ended up becoming scripture, and thus joining the 24 scrolls or books of the Hebrew Bible, was only worked out slowly over the course of the next several centuries. Really more than half a millennium in some ways. But the process was begun in Babylon in many important ways. And while many of these books clearly include material from before the exile in 587 BCE, how much is a subject of intense debate. And even that which is older has been filtered through the lens of the Jewish exiles and their experience in Babylon. Well, what lens exactly? What is the experience in Babylon? The overriding argument that permeates the Hebrew Bible as it was preserved, edited, and added to by the Jewish exiles and their descendants is that there is only one God, that he has a plan for the Hebrew people, not only the Jews, now only the Jews after the loss of the 10 tribes, and that when they forsake God for other gods of polytheism, they are punished. That became the explanation for why the kingdom of Israel was destroyed, and later why the kingdom of Judah was destroyed, that they had forsaken their covenant or deal with the one God. It's clear from a careful reading of the Hebrew Bible that the ancestors of the Jews had not always been quite so strictly monotheistic theologically. For instance, if we look at the Ten Commandments, which seem to be quite old, they don't say that there are no other gods. They simply say, in God's voice, that thou shalt hold no other God before me, which is not quite the same thing as monotheism, believing that there is only one God. Although some material from later writers found throughout the Hebrew Bible, all the way back into Genesis, is stricter. And this is one of the ways that suggests that the Hebrew Bible was edited at this later point. There's also evidence from archaeology that even before this time, the ancient Israelites, whether in Israel or Judah, or even before the kingdoms, had ritually separated themselves from surrounding people as a way of creating a sense of identity. We have evidence that basic elements of kosher, that is, certain dietary restrictions practiced among the Israelites and later Jews, particularly avoidance of pork, go centuries further back than the Babylonian captivity. And perhaps circumcision of males did as well. We know, for instance, that the ancient Egyptians practiced circumcision, and some scholars point to this as proof of a real Egyptian connection like that found in Genesis and Exodus. But it's also very clear that the Jewish exiles editing the Bible wanted to emphasize both their religious distinction, monotheism, and the Hebrew Bible itself, and their cultural distinctions, like kosher and circumcision, to firmly distinguish themselves from the people around them, the non-Jews, or in Hebrew the term is Gentiles. Distinguishing themselves from Gentiles is why Jews survived as an independent people when so many other exiles, like the earlier 10 lost tribes, disappeared in the brutality of the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires. The Hebrew Bible became for the Jews more than simply a religion, but a profound marker of ethnic identity, one which, unique in all of history, has provided a continuous, if also continuously evolving, sense of identity over the course of 2,500 years or more, long after all the contemporaries of these earliest Jews in the Middle East and many younger cultures have fallen and been, in many cases, largely forgotten. Along with other symbolic markers like kosher and circumcision, as well as other texts later like the Talmud and the Mishnah that we'll discuss in Part 2, the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh quickly came to help define what it meant to be Jewish, even when they did not have a political kingdom or geographic territory to call their own. Well, that's it for Part 1. In Part 2, we'll pick up with the aftermath of the Babylonian captivity and see how the Jewish people, with their new Tanakh, relate to some of the other cultures that we've been looking at, like the Persian Empire, the Hellenistic kingdoms, and finally the Roman Empire.